data, we've proved it now, that the most radioactive contaminated milk from dairies around nuclear power plants, such as 3 Mile Island and the Peach Bottom reactor in Pennsylvania, that's the first place they discovered it. The radioactive milk is being shipped directly into black inner city communities. And that is why blacks who come from Africa have the lowest infant mortality. They have very normal babies, very healthy babies. And so how can you explain why blacks in the United States have the highest infant mortality, the highest cancer rates, the highest breast cancer and prostate cancer rates? Why do their children have the highest asthma rates? It can only be explained by environmental causes, and radiation is the culprit. Here, if you look at New York City, you can see that Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn have the highest rates of diabetes in New York City, and if you look at Manhattan and the affluent white areas, they have the lowest rates. They're all drinking the same water. Drinking water and dairy products are the two main pathways for radiation into the body. We found the same pattern in Washington, D.C. The highest rate for mortality from cancer is in the United States, and the black population is in Washington, D.C. And the lowest death rate or mortality rate for cancer in the white population is in Washington, D.C. We looked at San Francisco County by race. The highest infant mortality is in the black population, and when they turned the nuclear power plant off in Sacramento, Rancho Seco, which contaminated all the drinking water for the Bay Area because it was snowed out and rained out in the Sierras, infant mortality for Asians and whites went almost down to very, very low rates, but in the black population, it stayed high, and it continued to go up when there were accidents and leaks at nuclear power plants, and it went down when the nuclear power plants were shut down. So it's very clear that nuclear power has replaced bomb testing fallout in the United States, but also that U.S. government policy is to pass on the most radioactive contaminated food and dairy products to black populations. This is genocide. It's a deliberate, hidden nuclear war against blacks and Hispanics in the United States. And in this map of the United States, you can see the highest rates of diabetes are in the Gulf Coast states. And this is where the sand and dust storms carry the radiation across the Atlantic, loaded with depleted uranium. It smacks into the states Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. It's rained out, and it's an environmental cause. There's no way getting around it. And you see the same thing on the Pacific coast of the United States of America. This is a map of Japan. This is total mortality. This is from 1899 through 2004. And what this map tells us is that this very low line, which you can see below the infectious disease mortality up until the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped on Japan, cancer is actually very low. Cancer increased slowly from the time of the A-bombs dropped in World War II on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it has continued to increase. So the bomb testing fallout caused malignant neoplasms, or cancer, to increase in Japan. You can also see that cerebrovascular and cardiovascular diseases also increased. when nuclear power plants came online, that was radiation in addition to the bomb testing fallout. So the rate increased more steeply, and then in 1991 you can see in this data very clearly that there is a very steep increase in mortality from cancer in Japan. And you can see the 1996-97, that big leap when the big heavy no-fly zone grid bombing and carpet bombing occurred in Iraq. In fact, we are all Gulf War veterans. In August of 2004, Terry Jemison of the Department of Veterans Affairs stated to Christopher Bolin, a journalist at the American Free Press, that in the 14-year period since 1991, or 13-year period, Gulf-era soldiers who had served in the Gulf region, there were over 518,000 on medical disability. And in that same period, only 7,039 soldiers were wounded on the battlefield. This is a horrendous, very, very high rate. It's over 50% of the soldiers are ill. They're on medical disability. This is the highest rate in any history of any battles or wars in the United States. Terrell Arnold, who's been responsible for training our most senior and most promising military officers as chairman of the Department of International Studies at the U.S. National War College in Washington, D.C., reports that coalition dead and wounded may actually be twice what the U.S. government admits, and that including the effects of our use of depleted uranium and other toxic weapons, quote, a long-term casualty rate for American forces of 40 to 50% appears realistic. So if they're teaching that, if they're knowledgeable about that at the top war college in the United States, then the government is fully aware of what is happening, and so are the senior officers in the military. In fact, a military publication, one of their magazines, stated several years ago that only 270 American soldiers have been tested for depleted uranium exposure, and yet we have over 500,000 on medical disability. I took a bill from the Connecticut legislature, which the Speaker of the House authored. Her name is Pat Dillon. She's an epidemiologist from Yale, and she knew a sick soldier. So she wanted to do something to help them at the state level. And I took that bill to Louisiana in February of 2005. And I was completely astounded. I gave the bill to a Vietnam veteran at an anti-war rally in the French Quarter on the steps of the Louisiana Supreme Court building. 2 months later, the governor signed it into law, effective immediately. And we now have 18 states that have introduced or passed bills in their legislatures to treat and test the National Guardsmen. And the states can only pass this legislation for the National Guardsmen because they do not have legal jurisdiction over the regular military. Much to my astonishment, this pushed states' rights against federal rights, and it also made the regular military personnel angry because they were not getting the same treatment as the National Guardsmen. And so they began putting pressure on Congress and the Pentagon. And so we now have a dynamic that is opening the issue in the United States. And I hope that more and more states, and I'm sure they will pass this bill that puts more pressure on Congress. Also, Arcata in Northern California has introduced a bill. And so we want to thank legislators around the United States, citizens around the United States, and most of all the Vietnam veterans who have been the best supporters of these bills and really help facilitate them through the state legislatures. So you never know what will happen. You just have to try. Because if you don't try, nothing can happen.